I'm sure you heard about the story about Aaron's golden calf. So, what happened was when Israel escaped Egypt and then they came to wilderness, and when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the tablets for the Ten Commandments, Aaron made a golden calf, and in front of the golden calf, the whole congregation of Israel, they danced and they sang to worship God. But the thing is, when they worshiped that golden calf, they were worshiping none other than the God of Abraham. So, although they were singing and dancing in front of that golden calf, they were worshiping God. But God was still very angry with that people, so he punished them with a great punishment. So why was he angry with them? It's because doesn't matter if a symbol or some kind of form symbolizes God or not, God prohibits to fashion any kind of form or symbol with our hands to symbolize any God. So even though what you make with your own hand symbolizes God, it's still a sin. So that was a great sin that Israeli people committed at the time. But the same thing is happening these days. So this sin of idol has infiltrated the church, and Christians are not even realizing it. So there is an idol that are in the church that symbolizes God. So what is the object which is made by a human that symbolizes God? So it's none other than the cross. The cross symbolizes Jesus, who is a triune God. So if it symbolizes Jesus, it symbolizes God. So the cross is an object made by hand that symbolizes God. So it's the same thing as the Aaron's golden calf. So these days, most churches, they have the cross erected either on top of their church or in front of the congregation. And Christians, they sing and dance, and they don't worship the cross, but they worship God. But it's still a sin because Israeli people, they worship none other than God Himself when they worship God. So this is Exodus chapter 32, verse 4 to 5. So this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. So when they molded the calf, they were saying, this is the God who led them out of Egypt. So they made this golden calf to symbolize God of Abraham. And also it says here, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. So they were saying, oh, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. So in front of this golden calf, they plan to worship God in a feast to the Lord. So the next day they sang and danced and they worshiped the Lord. But it was still a great sin. So this great sin is happening every Sunday in all the churches. So why is it a great sin? Because we know that God was very, very angry and He punished Israeli people with a great punishment. So Moses called out all the men who will be on the side of God, and he said, bring a sword with you and kill family members. So it was a great punishment by God. So these days, most churches are committing this sin of idolatry. So God will punish them greatly in the great tribulation that is coming. So this is Revelation chapter 2, verse 20. My servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. So this sexual immorality and idols, these are two of the most prevalent sins in the church right now. So it says here, unless they repent of their deeds, I will kill her children with death. And it says, I will cast her into a sickbed and those who commit adultery with her into a great tribulation. So because of these great sins, all the churches are in danger to be thrown into the great tribulation. And in the great tribulation, even the small children, they have to not bow down to Antichrist and hold their faith to Jesus, even in the face of horrendous torture. Like the torture will be just like in hell. So the Antichrist and his followers will have all the means to do anything they want to the bodies of the Christians who reject Antichrist. So it will be like hellish torture. So even the little children will have to endure that kind of torture to earn salvation. So it will be a terrible judgment by God in the Great Tribulation. So that's how God is so displeased with this sin of idolatry. And if I say this, some people might say, oh, when I go to the church to worship God, I don't worship the cross. And I don't even think the cross is God. And I only worship God. So I'm just ignorant of that cross. It's just there. And that's not what I worship. But if you do that, it's still a sin. Because this is Exodus chapter 23, verse 24. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. So any objects, whether or not they symbolize God or other gods, any kind of objects that symbolize any god, they are idols. So it says here, you have to utterly overthrow them and completely break down the idols. So unless you do that, then you haven't repented from the sin of idolatry. So to worship God in a manner pleasing to God, you have to completely cleanse the place of worship of all the idols and the objects that are displeasing to God. Only then you can worship God that can be accepted by God. So like for instance, if you see an idol of Buddha in the church in front of the congregation, then if you think, oh, I don't worship to Buddha, I just worship to God. This is just a sin that this church is committing. I don't have anything to do with that idol of Buddha. Then is that still acceptable by God? No. Whether or not you think that's an idol or not, if you still worship God in that kind of setting, then you are committing the sin of idolatry. Just like the people who worship God in front of the golden calf. It's the same sin. So unless you completely overthrow the idol before you worship in that place, then you're committing the sin of idolatry. So what shall we do? So before the great tribulation comes, we have to completely overthrow all these idols. And if your church does not repent, then leave the church. Otherwise, you will partake in their sin, in idolatry, and you will be thrown into the great tribulation, and you will pay a great price. So if you realize this, I wish you so that you can make the decision to finally stand for God and get rid of all the sin of idolatry in your life and in your church. Or get out of the church that is Babylonized and live for this world and worship God that is acceptable and pleasing to God. Then you will not have to endure the great tribulation. I wish you blessings from the Lord.